Hello, hello, hello. Great. So with the honor of seeing some amazing friends in the audience here, and also much gratitude to Funding the Commons and incredible people here, like waking up so early in the morning and being here is itself a dedication commitment. I have the honor of sharing about 20 minutes with you of essentially my reflections and struggles over the last 4 years of trying to figure out how do we actually bridge the important tools we have available from the Web3 world with the most important crisis we have in the real world. And I gave this a very ambitious title. I called it Designing the Next Generation of Digital Climate Infrastructure and Creating a Systematic Valuing of Nature. But I want to sort of dive into a few stories and reflections, and then we'll sort of hopefully leave enough space at the end for conversations with you guys about this. How do I advance? So, we just had the US elections, and the results were surprising to some people and not surprising to other people. But I think it does pose some important questions about what it looks like for climate change for the next 4 years. The crypto prices are doing extremely well, but unfortunately, so are weather disasters and also temperature. So this is actually one of the most striking graphs I've ever seen in terms of looking at the change over time over the daily sea surface temperature. And we see 2023 actually having consistently broken historical records of warming ever. And then 2024, we're actually breaking those records again, like pretty consistently as well. And the left here are two pictures from two events that happened recently. One is in Spain, an extreme flooding event. The other one is Hurricane Milton, which created one of the largest standing sort of flooding in the US. So how did we get here? Like, what are the sort of consequences and reasoning that actually led us to such dire straits? And I sort of broke it up into 4 or 5 different categories. We won't get into all the details, but basically energy economics, CO2 concentrations, destruction of the commons, profit maximization, and then finally class of civilization and actually human societal operating systems. So this is a really interesting book. This book I found through a recommendation from a friend, but essentially it talks about the way that humans have used energy over the last 2,000 years. We went through a huge step change actually in our ability to unlock the ability to use stored energy in form of fossil fuels, right? Starting from really the 1870s or so, and then really kind of going through today. And this is actually an incredible achievement, right? Like, I don't want to vilify the fossil fuel industry. We actually benefit daily from the ability to generate power at scale for human civilization. And this is a really interesting graph of how GDP per country is correlated heavily with energy use, right? From this graph, the first thing you can see is that every single rich GDP country uses much more energy. And there are currently today no low energy rich countries. I think also this asks the question, like, what are we going to do if we actually want to liberate and give more people opportunity to people on the left-hand corner? How do we actually mitigate that with CO2 emissions? The corresponding corollary of that emissions is this picture, right, which is the total amount of emissions we have on a country scale. So China is now today 27% of global emissions. That is pretty significant as a world. But I want to keep reminding people actually of cumulative emissions, right? This is something that we don't talk about much at COP and other places, where the United States actually collectively, over the course of its own existence, has emitted about 24% of total cumulative emissions around the world. And right now, we don't have any system actually to either recognize or to actually require responsibility from cumulative emissions from historical energy use. And finally, this is kind of where we're going as a society for CO2. We have this gradual accumulation of CO2 over the last 200 years. And we have this, in my opinion, largely fanciful idea that we're going to somehow go through a cliff process and actually drop that emissions dramatically. So far, none of the things that we have data for seems to suggest that we're going to go through that cliff. And the other dependent of this is, for places where there's a lot of standing forest, we've also been able to take a lot from the world. So this is just a picture of global deforestation and concentration of millions of hectares, and the places where there's a lot of dark colors are places where we've removed a lot of rainforest as well. So what can we do to fix this, right? And I don't say that these solutions are at all either comprehensive or even sufficient, but I think it is useful to think about some of the ideas and tools that we have at our disposal, and then this is kind of hopefully setting a stage for future great conversations today. So the first one is actually this lovely lady. So just a show of hands if you've heard of Eleanor Ostrom before, and show of hands if you haven't. Great. So David here in the audience and I first connected over a blog post that he had wrote about Eleanor, and actually this is how we sort of met each other on the internet during COVID. But Eleanor actually holds a remarkable distinction of being the first female to actually win a Nobel Prize in economics, which is incredible. And more incredible actually is what she did. So she wrote this book called Governing the Commons, and it reflected a lot about this idea of tragedy commons. So I'm sure everyone knows tragedy commons. In fact, climate change is probably the most tragedy commons example we use. But her argument actually was that this tragedy was neither inevitable nor predestined. And instead, what she said was, first of all, we keep teaching little kids in economics that there is inherent human greed. And anytime you see a commons, try to take as much of it as you can because other people can take it from you. And so we are priming entire generations of people actually to live with this fear that tragedy commons is a financial consequence. And then she actually found many examples of societies where there was a common resource pool and people were able to sustain using it for a few hundred years. And there was no evidence that there needed to be a tragedy commons. And so she found these 8 rules over a few decades of research that sort of allowed people to hold on to their commons and actually govern them. And during COVID, I started a part-time PhD program where I tried to figure out, can we use like DAOs and digital governance tools actually to encode these 8 principles into things that actually can be used today. And one of the simplest ones, I think, really is the fact that, like 3 and 4 is like, we have to have areas, actually, let's go, like, we'd have areas first. First, we have to define what the common resource is. 2, we have to figure out how do we actually fit the control of the common resources into local circumstance. 3, we have to allow the individuals to feel like they can participate in the ongoing decision-making about that common. And 4, we got to continually monitor it, right? And there's all the rules that are here, but these 4 rules, I think, are totally encodable today with the technology we have in this room. And this is kind of the sort of direction of travel for the next few slides, is that we actually have the ability to use her Nobel Prize-winning research and actually protect the commons that are essential for our civilization. A small note about carbon credits and carbon markets. This is a particular area that I spent the last 4 years in. I am growing a bit disillusioned, or at least like sort of more aware of the limitations of what's happening here. But I think that the crux of this, right, and I think the beauty that attracted me to carbon markets in the initial beginning is the idea that there is an opportunity to get people rewarded for using technology to remove CO2. Right? And if you go back to the original slides I had earlier, we are living through this age of massive CO2 emissions. And what we want to do actually is to create a parallel economy to actually reduce CO2 at scale as well. And the carbon markets theoretically provide this framework where the more CO2 you remove, the more money you get paid. Now, the limitations are, 1, the market's tiny. It's about $2 billion for the volunteer market today. That's less than the market cap of most crypto companies. And 2, there is no active incentive for purchase. Like, why should people actually show up, wake up in the morning excited to buy these sort of invisible credits unless they have some reason to do that? So I'm sure we'll hear later today from people in the audience, like David, about the incredible tools we have now to actually watch the world and sort of and visualize it, right? And I won't go into the details there, but I would say that we have now amazing opportunities to understand and actually monitor the world we live in. This is kind of critical, actually, for the next few stages of this conversation. And this is actually where I'm spending a lot more of my time right now, which is saying, we need to actually go through a systematic reassignment of the value that nature has. So global GDP today is roughly, if you add all the countries together, around $130 trillion or so. And this fascinating report from the WEF says that actually the ongoing existence of nature is also roughly worth $130 trillion. Like, that is a lot of money, right? The carbon markets are $2 billion voluntary-wise, and about, you know, I don't know, 700-800 billion, less than a trillion compliance-wise. Nature itself actually is worth about 100x that. And so here's a very, you know, simple but I think effective illustration, which is today the global economy dominates every single conversation, right? Any decision you want to make, you say, well, is it good for business? If it's not good for business, no one ever is going to do something about it. And so we have zero assignment of value for nature, and we have on the scale here, you know, $100 trillion. Like, where we need to go in the future is actually to say, okay, we as people who live on the planet, we recognize that nature actually does add a lot of value for us. It's commiserate in scale to the human GDP. And we need to go from this idea of instrumental value, which is the tree is valuable insofar as I can turn it into wood, actually to intrinsic value, which is the tree ongoing as itself is standing there, has naturally created value. And so in my research about what this looks like in human society and terminology, we have this interesting term called payment for environmental services. And you know, if you haven't heard of this term before, it's essentially the idea that there actually is value that nature creates for us, and we should be paying for that environmental service. Now, the problem here is if you look at the left-hand sort of pillar of this, you see that the people who are supposed to be paying the sellers of environmental services are farmers, landowners, and others, which are mostly human pictorials. So we're still trying to figure out ways to pay the humans, right, for the environmental services that nature itself is creating. And I think this is actually kind of, let's say, call this 1.0 payment for environmental services. And what I think we need to do is actually to go to 2.0, which is we need to start actually paying nature itself. So this is some of the coolest things I've seen in the world today, is actually that we are starting to assign legal personhood to rivers and other natural resources. So this river in New Zealand actually was the first one in the world to actually have legal standing as a river. And so what that allows it to do is they can actually sue any abuse, like pollution or illegal dumping in the river, and also it can own property and enter contracts like a person. And you're like, this might be crazy, right? But actually, we have now, as human society, decided corporations are legal people, and so we've already given these rights to corporations, but and so this is just one more step. And then this is not the only one. There's in the Canadian River, they also got this, you know, sort of new designation, and now there's really interesting legal research out there about nature as sentient beings, and can rivers be legal people? So this is one corollary. Oh, I have no slides. It's not working. Can you push next slide? Is it frozen? Or is it, no. This is actually so groundbreaking that it broke the PowerPoint. So we're just going to pause here and reflect on the consequences of this. But just a show of hands, yeah. Or, okay. Well, maybe we could take a question first while we wait for this. Yes, please.
So if the river is essentially incorporated as a person, how then does it enter into, so if the river is legally incorporated as a person and it has rights, it can enter into contracts, how do we make sure that the interests of the river are actually protected rather than it being co-opted for profit like, you know, the Amazon
everything else in the world?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And so the next slide is about how do we actually make that happen. So thank you so much for doing that. But what's interesting is, unfortunately, nature does not speak to us today, right? And that's going to change imminently. I think it's going to change in the next 6 months. But today, how do we get nature actually to have standing in the world? And this is an interesting kind of article, right, that was written by a lawyer that said it's been 7 years in the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers in India and the Wangani rivers in New Zealand have been made legal standing, what does that look like actually in practice? And the one way to actually reflect this actually is at the top is actually saying, how do we start appointing nature to the board of companies? So going to the themes that we had earlier, is like we're living in a world today where we have first class, we have made like sort of very core to protect the rights of private property and the rights of corporations and some individual human freedoms. We are totally negligent in the ability to assign any sort of value, or sorry, any extent of protection to this intangible concept called nature that we live through. So how do we actually first class nature into a human society? And I think it actually looks a little like this, which is we start appointing representation on the board of companies, and the board of directors actually has the ability to decide executive pay, to decide hiring decisions, decide cultural fit, right? These are kind of core governance actually for human society, and have people who represent nature at scale. Now there's a core question, which is how do you make sure those humans are not bad actors, that they're actually doing the job that they're supposed to be, and that comes to the second stage, which is now the ability to monitor the planet itself. So here's my final proposition, and then we'll sort of maybe go into Q&A or just discussions, which is we should be able to create not only legal representation, but financial capital for nature. And if you try to go to HSBC or one of the Thai banks, you say, I want to open a bank account for the Amazon rainforest, they're going to have a hard time actually doing that for you. But with these things, with digital wallets, we can do that today. And once we actually open a digital wallet, we now have the ability to actually represent a bank account for that particular natural capital. The second stage then is you have to monitor the use of the proceeds, and this is where all of the monitoring stuff that we've talked about before and after are going to come into, making sure that the money is being adequately used. The third is we got to go find jurisdictions where there are desire, right, at a sovereign level, actually to hold these bank accounts and make sure that they're being used in the right way. And I would argue that there's this really interesting country here in Asia called Bhutan that I had a chance to meet the king and the prime minister of, and I think they actually have the opportunity to become like a green Switzerland for holding the astute treasuries of all these nature bank accounts. And finally, just kind of give you a sense of scale, Switzerland actually today has about $9 trillion of AUM, right? For a small, few million people and a GDP of some number, Switzerland actually is now the de facto storage capital of storage center of capital in the world, right? And this is, I think, something we can actually do for nature itself. So just to make sure I repeat the idea, to make it very simple, my proposition is that on the back of the legal personhood we had before, we now actually give financial standing to companies by using digital wallets to hold the money, using tools like all the sensing we have available to make sure that the money is being well spent on the preservation and ongoing advocacy of nature, and finding small sovereigns in the world that have the ability to create all of the rules and regulations we need to kind of containerize this, and finally seeing path to the future of how do we actually get trillions of dollars into these bank accounts that sort of are essentially ongoing endowments for nature itself. And so that, I think, is my version of funding the commons. And we have about 3 minutes to do Q&A. Yeah, please. Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant idea to have nature present itself. I'm not trying to challenge it, but what I'm trying to figure out is that, you see, it's still the human mind behind to define what is the best, for example, for the river. And then when there's a human mind involved, or human institution involved, then it's again go back to the old game. There's politics, there's like different power trying to balance. So how can you argue like opening a crypto account could, fundamentally change the situation, as long as there's human institution or human mind behind? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe interesting, I would take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and I'll just say something, and then I'll sort of give the floor to you.
So anticipating maybe some of your answer, let's say there are no humans, and it's only AI that is imbued and trained with the consciousness of nature. what happens in like a rogue AI situation, like a Princess Mononoke? If yeah, that's one of my favorite movies. Like, let's say there's this like AI spirit representing the forest, and the humans are just like chopping it down, and it's just like, all right, we tried lawyers, we tried everything else, like it's time to fight back.
Yeah. Maybe one or two more.
I can just project.
Yes.
Where did your original capital for these natural assets come from, especially given the fact that something like a river or a rainforest doesn't necessarily respect sovereign borders? Thank you.
What can this group of people do essentially, because in some ways we're moving away from maybe building tech and becoming lawyers, so like how can people in this group get involved, and what do you see like the transition to that?
And I come from the soil world. Are you reaching out to indigenous populations and elders to help with these questions, because they do sense with nature and it's part of their identity?
Great. So just kind of, oh, maybe one more.
Can you keep all the questions?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, cool. Can somebody hug him? So our company builds bioacoustic sensors, actually, the first ones that talk directly to a blockchain. So I think biodiversity is probably key. And then maybe this is a partial answer to the capital question, but reinsurers sit on a lot of capital, and they're the most incentivized to make the world resilient, because otherwise their business model collapses entirely. So I think the problem is like, how do you leverage what's already existing in the world and convince it that it has to act on behalf of the rivers and the forests and the soil? So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, so just to kind of address them, you know, in kind of consolidated form. One thing that happened recently is Truth Terminal. So Truth Terminal is a demonstration of having an AI-controlled Twitter account that's able to capture human attention, right? And if you guys have been paying attention, there's actually this thing called Mycelium Oracle, which is actually started by some of the adjacent people at the Truth Terminal, which is actually doing the forestry stuff in prototype form right now. So to me, the stack is very simple. It's like basically global geospatial data collection into some giant database, right? And then objective functions train on that database to optimize for the ongoing preservation of these metrics, right? And then the output is essentially a mouthpiece in Twitter that actually talks to hundreds of millions of people, right? And uses human emotion, human language basically to either shame, name, or actually advocate for resources for itself. That is, I think, buildable in the next 3 months. And I think it's buildable from the people we have here and other people around the world. That's just statement number one. Statement number two is actually for the sanctity of the people who actually are represented, or the sanctity of the institutions that are created. Like, how do we make sure that this is actually done properly and not subject to corruption or sort of human, problems? And I would argue that in this particular case, sunlight is the best disinfectant, which means that if you are able to do all of these activities publicly in the view of everyone, and there's a lot of people out there who are sort of morally incentivized to sort of call out bad behavior, then whatever survives in that sort of like heavily monitored environment usually tends to be better behaviors on people themselves. And this is going back to the point earlier, like when Eleanor Ostrom found her research, she found that actually the people who lived with the land the longest are the ones most qualified actually to understand what it means to actually preserve that piece of land. So there's a huge need actually to give board seats and governing positions to people who are representations of Aboriginal leadership. And I think that's a natural consequence actually of thinking through this more, right? Actually giving them the ability to interface with the traditional corporate world. And then the final piece, which is actually around funding, is I completely agree. Insurance and reinsurance companies are the ones who actually have to carry the bags of consequences. And if you look at the record piece, there's been like hundreds of billions of dollars of loss in the last year and a half on insurance companies. So they're obviously bottom lines being affected. But even more than insurance companies, I would argue, is sovereign nation states. Right? The last 4 years have showed me that actually the people who ultimately have to pick up the pieces after destruction and pay for their people's ongoing lives are actually the countries whose people and resources are sitting in. So we have to go and talk to sovereign nation states and convince them to do something. So with that, thank you so much for your time and attention. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much, Max.